So, we are having our last meeting of the semester today. We've been studying this book called Idols of the Mind versus True Reality. Basically, it's an introduction to the complementarity of science, philosophy, and religion, which is what our panel discussion with some faculty members here is about next Friday. So, this presentation goes into the topic of the last two chapters, and it's also a review of what we've been talking about for the whole semester, basically. So, I'm going to be leaning on Yater a little bit to help me out with the first part about mechanical, chemical, and biological systems, because we talked about it, and he's picked up on a lot of what we've been saying. If this works, that would be better. All right. There we go. So, we had a couple of book reviews from this book. One of them was from Professor Like here at Stockton, just to give a little context for how this book is relevant to what's going on in science and philosophy and religion today. So she said that readers looking for a bridge between ancient Hindu philosophy and its Western counterpart will appreciate the general nature of his text. This book serves as a useful synopsis of the main arguments for looking beyond materialist science toward a more holistic worldview. Although some readers will find the pace and breadth of Dr. Poor's arguments disorienting, others will appreciate its comprehensiveness and straightforward presentation. In any case, the message is an important one, as materialist philosophy continues to wreak havoc on social relationships and the environment around the world. I'm just going to close the door so that sound. There we go. Thank you. So, the cover of the book. So this is the last presentation, so we just want to show how the cover of the book is kind of the metaphor for what the whole book is about. Idols of the mind versus true reality. Basically what we're saying is sometimes the way people think is completely determined by their own biases, and it might not match what's actually there. You know? So this can affect any sphere of knowledge, whether it's philosophy, science, or religion. Sometimes people just think what they want to think despite what's actually in front of them. So Idols of the Mind versus True Reality is pointing out how that has happened in the development of science and philosophy, and how to hopefully correct that. So that's what our attempt is. So, in order to kind of explain more what we mean by, or show why that's misleading, why idols of the mind are misleading, we turn to a parable of the blind men and the elephant, which is talked about in many places. So basically there are 6 blind men, and they're each touching a part of an elephant. But they don't know what the elephant is as a whole. They just know the one part they're touching. So the guy in the back touching the tail thinks he's touching a rope. The blind man on the body of the elephant is thinking he's touching a wall. The fellow touching the ear thinks it's a fan. The guy touching the leg thinks it's a tree trunk. The guy touching the trunk of the elephant thinks it's a cobra. And the guy touching the tusk thinks it's a spear. And again, they don't know the context of the whole. All they know is the isolated experience of the part. So when they all come together, and they tell each other what they experience, and they put together what the whole is in this kind of reductionist way, they get that picture up there, the idol of the mind, like some kind of monster with a snake face and a thick body, and something completely absurd and only very, very loosely connected to what the actual elephant is. So in the same way, when we take reductionist, mechanistic, and physicalist presumptions in science, it's also, those are isolated from the context and the relational, purposeful the phenomena that we're studying. If we're reducing a cell just to its molecules, or if we're reducing an organism to just matter and motion, atoms, and we're not taking into account the intention of the actions of that organism, and again, its relations to the environment. If we're reducing all of that to just atoms and motion, then we're losing so much of what's actually going on. So the first part of the presentation will now be about how humans are beyond mechanical, chemical, and biological explanations. The first part will just review what those explanations were. We talked about it in the first chapter. Basically, we're saying that mechanical, chemical, and biological frameworks are three categorically different ways where biological encompasses all three, with three categorically different ways of seeing something, where mechanical is actually very incomplete if we stop there. In order to get a complete picture, we have to include mechanical, but then move on to a chemical perspective when we're talking about life. But we can't stop at chemical either. We have to see it as a biological whole. And what do we mean by that? Because it seems obvious in some ways, but what we actually mean logically by mechanical, chemical, and biological isn't always so clearly talked about, you know? So we try to do that here. When we say mechanical, the relationship between this desk and this pointer is a mechanical relationship. It's just an external relationship. There's no internal bonding or anything like that, right? I'm an external agent, and I put the pointer on the desk, and I can easily take it off. So the relationship is very superficial. It's completely based on an external force. There's nothing inherent in either of the two objects to make them come together. So that's the same with any mechanical system, a clock. Even within organisms, you know, like the relationship between, you know, from the physics perspective, how bones work. Bones are just, you know, forces acting externally on the bones, and they can move up, down, left, right. Those are just very external perspectives. But we can't stop there, right? So there's a chemical relationship too, where now you have two atoms that have a tendency to bond with each other without a force making them bond, right? Hydrogen and oxygen, they're two gases, and they have some internal attraction to each other, and they become water. So they're bonding. There's something internal to both of those things, making them come together and become something new. It's not that something has to, you know, externally take a hydrogen atom, the two hydrogen atoms, and externally take one oxygen and smash them together. They come together of their own accord, you know. Yeah. So, but that's, you know, it's an important distinction to make between the mechanical level, where only an external force is bringing them together, but the chemical level, there's some internal attraction. But that unity never lasts. It's always wanting to change. So even though water is very stable, still it can react with methane and become something completely new. So there's another level of organization where that internal attraction exists, but it's a more stable, self-maintained unity. So when a biological object comes in contact with another object, instead of changing into something completely new, it makes that other, it transforms it into itself. Right? So what do we mean by that? You have a bear, you have blueberries, and you have salmon. Right? They're three different organisms. And when the salmon and the bear comes together, they don't make a half bear, half, you know, salmon, where they don't make something new. Rather, the bear eats the salmon and it integrates it into whatever the bear needs to make itself a bear. So chemicals don't do that. It's not that when hydrogen and oxygen come together, the oxygen just becomes hydrogen. They both react and become something completely different. There were two gases, now they're a liquid. It's a completely different substance. And the same thing when you get the methane and the water, they become a crystal. So biological entities don't transform like that. They take what's other than themselves and they make it into themselves. So these are three very different distinctions that we find in nature. And biological includes the other two. Biological entities have chemical aspects in them. There's chemical processes in every living entity. There's mechanical relationships among its parts, but you can't reduce it to either of those two, otherwise you lose that perspective of the whole organism. You can't just reduce it to atoms, you can't just reduce it to chemicals. So to say all that in a more understandable way, the author of the book we're studying, his name is Dr. Bhimada, he gives the example of a book. So, in a book, you could say it's just paper and glue. It's true, books are made of paper and glue, but if you stop there, you don't have a complete understanding of the book, right? Then you can say, well, it's just a bunch of words put together. There's certain patterns for how those words fit together, rules of grammar. And that's also true, but still that's not a complete understanding of a book, right? A book, in its essence, is a thought, an idea that the author is trying to communicate. And then the grammatical patterns and the paper and ink come together to express that idea, but that idea is what's the main thing actually, right? So in this way we can understand that the biological entity has purposes, it's trying to do this, trying to do that, and when it's trying to achieve these purposes, then chemicals are reacting this way, the physics behind the molecules are working that way. But you can't just reduce it to those, because then you lose the purposes that the whole organism is trying to act upon, and you can only see those purposes from the perspective of the whole organism. You can't see a heartbeat from the perspective of just the cells that make up the heart. It's only the whole organ that's beating, So like this, trying to emphasize or advocate a more purpose-oriented approach to science and showing how you can't just reduce everything. That might be useful in some circumstances, but it can't just be haphazardly applied to everything, especially not biology. So that's so we described this. So this topic here is how humans are even beyond that biological explanation. So while that biological entity is always integrating its other into itself, we're eating it, we're breathing the air like that, which humans also do, of course, still humans have a capacity which those non-human living entities don't have. Humans have a capacity for self-conscious thought. It's not just eating the salad, it's thinking, oh, this is a nice salad, oh, this would, and maybe it's not such a nice salad, and this would make it a better salad. It has the capacity to reflect upon what it's doing and then change what it's doing, So this kind of self-reflective thought, animals don't have. They're conscious, but they're kind of locked into that immediate conscious experience without having any reflective capacity. So this sets humans even on a different categorical level than non-human living entities. And
a cell is not conscious?
It's conscious, it's cognitive, but it's not self-conscious. The cell has the capacity to cooperate with other cells in a tissue and an organ, and they have purposes for organ functions, so it's cognitive, but it's not reflecting upon itself. It doesn't have an idea of itself as a whole in relation to other wholes. It's more of an immediate kind of instinctual
survival.
Yeah, it's very rudimentary. So now this capacity of humans to have this self-consciousness, if we follow that development in a philosophical way, it also starts to bring us into the sphere of religious thought. So that's why this last chapter of the book, it was called The Unity of Science and Religion. This presentation is trying to show kind of a step-by-step progression of how we get to that point. Okay, so now we're basically going to address Hegel's point here, how cells or other non-human living organisms, they're conscious to various degrees, but only humans can develop self-consciousness or awareness of their conscious nature. In this slide we call it instinctual consciousness versus irrational or self-reflective consciousness. And so we have a picture here of a boy, a bird, and some bugs flying by the bird. So this capacity of the human to have a self-conscious nature is what gives rise to what some philosophers have called a second nature, which means culture, government, art, philosophy, science, religion. All these things that we're calling second nature here are basically fulfilling the need for people to try to express themselves and comprehend their environment. So art, we're seeing an environment and we're trying to express our unique view of the environment through the art that we're making. Government, we're self-conscious of our own capacities, our abilities and things we're not so good at, and how other people have they can do things we're not so good at, but we can do things they're not so good at. So now we can organize as a collective and have a society which goes beyond the capacity of animals. Like most animals are kind of locked into land or water or the air, right? But humans, they can have submarines, they can be in the desert, they can be in the rainforest, they can try to go to space, they can be flying air, but they can be in all aspects of the environment. No other animal has the capacity to do that. And the only reason humans can do that is because they're self-conscious and they've created this technological second nature which can move beyond the capacities of those non-human living entities that don't have that ability. And philosophy and science and religion are also coming from that same place of trying to understand who are we? Why do we have this capacity that no other living entity has? Now that we're conscious of this self, what is the purpose of the self? What is the purpose of life? Other animals don't ask questions like that. and we can say, someone might say, well, how do you know? How do you know that the bird isn't thinking like that? And we could reply, well, they don't have this second nature. Like the bird isn't making technology or books to try to reflect upon their society or their self. We don't see that. We see them sleeping and defending and mating, and that's basically it. We don't see any kind of reason to think that they have a very a deep inner life like humans have. We just kind of see some superficial things, and I mean, it's varied. We acknowledge that it's varied because some people say elephants have graveyards and that whales sing to each other across the ocean. And so we're not saying they're all the same exact level of consciousness, but there's a gradation. And humans have this capacity that seems to be kind of superior, I don't want to use that word, but kind of is more advanced than any of those other animals. So now, where does that lead? Did you have something you wanted to say?
I mean, yeah, I guess I can definitely see how we look more advanced, but with what you're saying with the bird, not that we've never given it the chance to write a book in a sense, but it just goes to show if you have your basic needs, there's probably more time for more things. We have a house, I don't have to sit and forage for food every single day. I have to take care of baby birds and whatnot, right? So I feel like we have the time on our hands to make it happen. And at that point, it's then what is natural? You're saying second nature. Is this second nature something that is natural? Right?
Yeah, those are important observations. And what you said about how that leisure time gives opportunity for those other things to arise. I mean, that's something a lot of philosophers have come to that conclusion. Thomas Hobbes is one person who talks a lot about that leisure time. And anyhow, so you're making very poignant observations. But the thing is, so we could say from that perspective, humans somehow had the ability to strive to achieve that leisure time and then use it in productive ways. If animals had that capacity, how come they haven't done it yet? Something they just keep doing the same thing in some ways. But anyhow, everything is evolving because everything is relational. So we could also talk about how because of the ways humans have used that capacity for higher thought in exploitive ways and how that has hurt the environment, then obviously the animals had to adapt. So it's not exactly, they had to find new ways to survive because it's a different environment due to all the pollution and deforestation. So obviously they have a capacity to adapt to new situations, but it just doesn't go to the extent that humans do. Why didn't the deforestation of that rainforest, the where the orangutans are, I forgot what it's called, but why didn't that deforestation make them have existential crises and have orangutans like, diving into the depths of philosophical thought of, I've been living here with my family for generations and now all of a sudden it's all changing. Why is this happening? Who am I? Orangutans don't do that, they just kind of hang in there scratching their bellies.
Rats the apes.
Yeah, that happens in human movies, but why don't we see that? Alright, so this is just a slide showing that humans have the capacity to reflect on the whole circumstance, so it's conscious of what's going on and it has a reflective capacity of what's going on. The birds, they see the bugs and they were thinking about how to get them, but there's no reflection on there's a guy looking at me, are there ants in this tree? What about the airplane over above? I'm living on planet Earth, the bird doesn't have that kind of reflection.
Really?
No. So due to the capacity for self-reflective thought, or self-consciousness, humans want to know beyond the mere appearance of phenomena and how humanity can benefit from it. So we're not satisfied with just seeing the bird there. We're thinking, so this will become relevant in the next slide. The picture of that bird is called the kingfisher. So this human is looking at the kingfisher and he's not just satisfied with looking at it. He wants to know how can he learn about this bird and how can that knowledge benefit him. So that's what gives rise to this science, right? You start studying the bird from biological perspectives, chemical perspectives, physics perspectives. And that can also give rise to engineering developments, biomimicry. So biomimicry is a real interesting field where people look at the design in nature, become inspired by the unique, you can say fine-tuned aspects of how nature works, and then takes that and applies it to a human problem. So in Japan, there was a bullet train, a really fast train that would exit a tunnel and make a giant bomb sound because the shape of the train just wasn't right. It confronted the air at the end of the tunnel too much and it made a huge sound. Nobody liked it. So the guy who designed the train, he was a birder in his spare time. He would go and watch birds. And he saw these kingfishers. And he noticed that when the kingfisher dove through the air into the water to get the fish, when the beak pierced the surface of the water didn't splash. Right? So the splashing of the water would be akin to the train coming out of the tunnel into the opening of the air, and the splash is like a giant sound. So because he didn't see the splash of water when the bird's beak entered the water, he thought, hey, maybe the geometry of the beak of that bird is such that it can perfectly penetrate a surface without making a huge disturbance. So they literally took the design of the beak of the kingfisher and they put it on a train, this bullet train in Japan, and it worked. And now it doesn't make a big bomb sound. So because of this second nature, the capacity of humans to reflect on the environment and to question and to apply it to problems that they're facing, you have these developments in engineering even. So reciprocally, we can say we don't see the bird looking for new designs for its nests based upon people's hairstyles or something. They kind of just always build the same nest and they're not looking for innovation really. So the interesting part about this example that takes us into a perspective that science historically has shied away from is that it shows that the objects are not static. Science would like to say that you have nature and then you have the scientist occupying a third-party perspective that doesn't affect the observation, right? Scientists are saying we can observe what's going on without affecting it at all. So when we study that and write it down and make our predictions and do the experiments, that's all happening in a way where the human element is removed and we're observing how nature is really working, right? But that's a problem because here we're seeing that the bird isn't simply a bird. The bird can be different things for people with different needs. So for conservationists. The kingfisher is kind of like an endangered species and they need protection. For the ancient indigenous people of the area where the bird lived, it was like an omen for bad things. For the engineer, the bird is a model for a bullet train. So basically, the object is what the subject needs it to be in some ways, you know? Not that it's completely transforming, but the subjective needs of the observer have a serious influence on the relationship between the object and the subject. It's not just an external, independent thing which is unaffected by the consciousness of the observer. You know? So that point is important because that's something that science historically hasn't dealt with, although that is changing in the last 5, 10 years. These things which have been talked about low-key for like 30, 40, 50 years are becoming more, you can't avoid them anymore. So that's kind of why this club is also coming about, trying to fulfill that need here. So this also demonstrates the interdependence of the moments of consciousness. So we're about to get into the moments of consciousness. So this idea that objects in nature aren't just static was also confirmed by a very famous quantum physicist, one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics. His name was Werner Heisenberg. He lived in the 1920s to the 1970s, something like that. And he said that science isn't about nature, it's about nature as exposed to our method of questioning. So it's important to reflect on that kind of stuff. And so basically following the development of these ideas will show why the materialistic approach to studying nature is insufficient and why it's actually filled with so many problems and contradictions and biases that aren't ever talked about but that are there and affect the conclusions that are drawn from those frameworks. So we have knowing, known, and knower. These are the three moments of consciousness. We have someone who's observing, we have the object that is being observed, and then we have that capacity of a relationship between the two for that object to exist in the consciousness of the knower. So that indicates that there's a relationship between the two. So knowing, knower, and known, these are the three moments of consciousness. So the reason that talking about this itself refutes physicalism or materialism, in order to understand why this does that, we should just talk about what physicalism says. We have three little points here about what physicalism says. One, it says the observed objects and the observer are external to and independent of one another. Two, that physical objects are fundamental to reality. And that three, consciousness reduces to matter and motion. So they say consciousness comes from matter. So the reason that talking about all this refutes these kind of ideas, especially the first point, if observed objects are independent from the observer and they're external to each other, then we can't even have this conversation. The fact that we're having this conversation about their relationship means that they can all become objects of consciousness. So this is now starting to get to one of the main points we're trying to make with this presentation is that everything starts with consciousness. Even matter itself, matter is an activity of consciousness. It's a particular bias, it's a particular set of presumptions, which ends up denying and ignoring the very foundation which is coming from, which is kind of like anticlimactic. But nonetheless, it starts with consciousness. You can't talk about anything, you can't touch, smell, taste, see, or hear anything unless you're conscious, unless consciousness is there. So that's a big point that doesn't get talked about a lot. So now we're going from these three aspects of knowing, known, and knower that we called moments of consciousness. From now on, we're just going to say consciousness and its content. So consciousness is like the container, the content is what's inside that container. So this is just the point I just said. All we have is consciousness. All our senses rely on being conscious. So that means that physicalism, materialism, or even spiritualism, or agnosticism, where agnosticism means you kind of like in the middle. You don't want to say you're a materialist. You don't want to say you're a spiritualist. You're saying I don't care. All of those kind of perspectives are experiences in consciousness. They all rely on being conscious and then observing your environment, making decisions based on that conscious observation. Even if that observation and conclusion ends up making you reject that consciousness as fundamental, still consciousness is necessary for you to even say that. So because of that, we're arguing that the capacity of any given worldview, its ability to acknowledge this fundamental aspect of consciousness and help other people to better understand that, is a sober and unbiased standard by which we can judge the validity of different worldviews. And this is, I think, the last slide in this section, and then the next section goes more into the religion side. So how do we get to physicalism if consciousness is fundamental? Like, how did that happen? Kind of like in thought, how does that happen? So consciousness takes its content. Content means the observer, the observing, and the observed, the relationship of all of them. It takes the content and it projects it outside of itself. It says, I'm here as an observer, there's something which I'm observing, but it's outside of me and it's independent from me. Then that consciousness is assuming that the externally projected content is more important. Now it's saying, I'm an observer and that's what's being observed, and that thing being observed has greater significance than me as an observer. Then consciousness forgets that whole process of what it just did. So it's left with some external content, which it thinks is very important, and it's left with its own conscious nature, which is always seeking, always being conscious, always having self-inquiry. And what it has to do is describe itself based upon that external projection now. So that's how you result with living conscious entities describing themselves as piecemeal aggregates of chunks of matter. So science typically tries to understand things in isolation from one another, but this produces abstractions or idols of the mind, like the title of the book, because everything is related to one another. Everything is relational. Similarly, consciousness cannot be understood apart from its role as an instrument of the individual self and the universal self. Consciousness always implies a self, the conscious self. So what is conscious? Consciousness doesn't just, consciousness implies something, someone is conscious. So you can't remove these two, otherwise you start to get into abstractions of things that don't really exist. Just as a hammer implies a carpenter who does the work through the hammer. So in that comparison, the hammer is like consciousness. It's a tool being used by a conscious person or a carpenter. So the senses are instruments of the intelligence. Right? The intelligence is trying to make sense of its world through its five senses. But then the intelligence is an instrument of consciousness. We can reflect on our thoughts of those sense perceptions. But that consciousness is an instrument of the self, the one who is observing. It's like a second order observer of that whole conscious activity. And it has more capacities than just consciousness, by the way. The self also has a capacity for love and joy, so these are more feeling oriented. But of course, feelings are also objects of consciousness. We're aware of how we feel. So ultimately, the self, as an individual, is an instrument of a supreme self or a universal. Okay, so the next slide shows what we mean by that. I forgot there was more stuff. So the tendency of the self to isolate itself from its instrumental function produces a false sense of self. So here we're just trying to describe how every more immediate, superficial thing is an instrument where it's being utilized by something of a higher order. So even the individual self, which we can liken to an individual cell in an organism, although it's cognitive, it's making decisions, it's living a life, that cell is an instrument of that higher order organism, which also has its own individuality, and on behalf of which the cells are doing all those activities. The cell is an individual, no doubt, and it's living its life as a heart cell or a lung cell or whatever, but beyond that, it's a part of a whole organism, which is beyond its immediate context. And that cell is serving the purposes of that whole organism. So in the same way, the finite self, the individual finite self, any of us, we're within something greater than ourselves. That also has that quality of selfhood and consciousness, which we're existing in instruments of. So basically, in religious terms, this is the relationship between the soul and God. But it's, as we show in the next few slides now, it's not, we're trying to show that this is not just a sentimental, blind faith position to come to, but that this is actually based on a very thoughtful and wide perspective of what's going on in our own direct empirical experience. So everything is floating in consciousness. So now, this book is written, like I said, by Dr. Bhimadeva. He's my teacher. He's the one who I've been studying under for the past 6 years, and we're practicing the Vedic culture from India, ancient India. So when I'm talking about here, this perspective is coming from that Vedic philosophy, from the Vedic tradition.
What caused him to practice
Who caused him to practice?
this?
Yeah. So he was a quantum chemist at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He graduated with his PhD and went on to do postdoc work at the National Bureau of Standards. So as a quantum chemist, you have to deal with quantum physics and chemistry. And he ran into the problem in quantum physics called the measurement problem, which is where the role of consciousness is necessary. They have an experiment called the double slit experiment, where they shoot a laser of electrons through a slit. There's two different slits. One is like a bunch of little dots. No, I'm sorry. It's one slit. There's a slit and a piece of metal, and they shoot a laser through it. When someone is observing that laser, there's something in the back that leaves a mark for the pattern that the laser leaves. So when you're looking at it, it just leaves a dot, like you would expect. You see a laser as a straight line, so it would make sense it leaves a dot. And that, as they found out, only happens when an observer is present. But when an observer is not present, then that electron laser makes a formation of a splattering. So they call it the collapse of the wave function. That when an observer isn't present at a quantum level, the totality of possibilities for a particular manifestation, they don't become determined to one thing. When there's not an observer, the possibilities remain.
How do they know this without an observer? You know what I mean?
Because, so the observation has to come after they shoot the laser. So when they're shooting the laser, there's someone like sitting there watching it, and then it comes out and they have the little dot, but then they have some kind of apparatus set up where they shoot the laser without a person having to be there, or they're not looking, I guess, and they shoot the laser and it leaves the splatter mark, and they have to observe it afterwards. But the difference is when the laser's being shot, someone's looking and someone's not looking. If you look it up, it's called the double slit experiment.
So when they shoot it and nobody's there, and then somebody comes and looks at it, it's red.
It's a splash to the red.
Okay.
So this is showing that consciousness affects empirical observation of matter. And that's something that completely, has to flip all materialistic science on its head, because it's all based on the fact that the observer doesn't affect what's being observed. So when he encountered that problem as a quantum chemist in DC, he was like, I just went through all these years of education thinking this was like, the highest level of education, and they had nothing to say about this. But that, for someone who takes what they're doing very seriously, you can't just overlook that and keep doing what you're doing. So he was like, all right, I gotta find, who knows about consciousness, who knows about this, because obviously the scientists don't. And basically he found yogi, people who were practicing yoga, a form of yoga called bhakti yoga. And that's where he found basically the answers that he was looking for, that consciousness implies a self, that the finite self implies the infinite self, that there's an eternal relationship between the finite self and the infinite self, and that the purpose of the human form of life with the self-conscious capacity and desire to know itself is to learn about that relationship. That's what Bhakti Yoga process is about. But how to do that in a scientific way such that it's not just based on a blind belief, but that our consciousness, our capacity to know is fully invested and fully utilized in that process of continuing to dive deeper and deeper into what that means. And so that's basically what brought him to this Vaishnava tradition, and what compelled him to continue doing this kind of work at the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. The person who became his guru told him to use that background in science to do that kind of work. So he never left. And that's what made him, the Bhakti Vedanta Institute has existed since 1976. Then he opened up the office in Princeton in 2012, and then I met him in 2018 there. So that's how we got here to Stockton. So now this is more about the background of that theistic development of consciousness. So recognition that consciousness is fundamental to reality has existed on Earth since ancient India's Vedic culture, based upon knowledge from the 4 Vedas. Texts such as the Vedas, Vedanta Sutra, Srimad Bhagavatam, they're all based on this foundation. So this is the first verse of the text called Bhagavatam. It says, Janmadasyato Nabhyad Itarat Charthveshu Avidya Swarat. It means that everything is born from that which is cognizant and independent. And again, this kind of starting place for knowledge is unassailable because, like we were saying before, any refutation still has to come from consciousness. So even if you want to deny the reality of consciousness, you have to be conscious in order to do that. So then, this idea has been known throughout history, which is why so many of the ancient civilizations saw everything as conscious, even the moon and the stars. And although that kind of viewpoint is opposed to current modern scientific viewpoint, it's an irrefutable view because consciousness being at the root of all arguments. So we like to say that the sun, the moon, the stars, everything is just an inert mass, but there has to be some degree of consciousness associated with that. It's existing in consciousness, it's existing in a reality where consciousness is fundamental. Just because we don't know, up until like 20 years ago, people thought cells were just masses of molecules, but it turns out cells are making decisions and are cooperating on our problem solving in ways that we didn't know about. So, was this an ancient knowledge that they weren't just like some crazy aboriginals when they thought the sun and the moon were conscious? They maybe actually had an advanced form of knowledge that we lost since then. There's reason to think that's the case. So it's inherently true, and a commitment to unbiased to accept and consider these kinds of facts. To just dismiss them is almost to abandon any kind of hope for truth. Rather, just stick with dogmas that are comfortable, that a bunch of people accept, and in order to just feel comfortable in that acceptance, you ignore anything that refutes it and just keep doing what you're doing. That's not a very nice way to go on. So by accepting this kind of idea and then actually integrating it into what we're doing in school and everything else, and work and our research and all aspects of life, then real progress is possible because we're not ignoring that. We're trying to integrate it. We're trying to really be honest with ourselves and with others. And it might be a messy process, but it'll lead us somewhere much better than we are now. So then our serving director, Dr. Puri, really emphasizes the sense of urgency that's necessary for having these kind of conversations, which is why we're having this program next Friday with the professors, and the sense of urgency for looking through this lens, because if the majority of educational institutions are not talking about this at all, then what kind of fulfillment is really going to come from the education? Like, yeah, we're prepared for workforce readiness to think critically about those problems that exist in those very narrowly defined spheres of sectors of business and like that. But what kind of fulfillment are we going to get from doing those things if our education hasn't given us this kind of foundation? We're going to be giving a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort to something which doesn't reciprocate, doesn't give us that feeling of satisfaction in return in any kind of lasting way. So basically, when we talk about this, we talk about the idea that when we try to look for fulfillment from something which is limited, then logically the fulfillment which comes from that thing is going to be limited. Anything that's limited won't last forever. So if our happiness is completely based on that limited thing, and that thing won't last forever, then obviously the happiness that we get from it won't last forever. So if we're really trying to invest our time and energy into something serious that has some lasting fulfillment, then we have to find something which is more permanent, is more lasting, not changing every 10 years, every 7 years. We've got to find something that's, dare I say, more eternal, something more spiritual. So Dr. Puri really tries to show the sense of urgency for having these kinds of discussions. He said it's paramount to acknowledge the detrimental impact this has had on education, and the urgency with which this issue must be unhesitatingly confronted. Any educational system that spreads this misconception must be deemed as bogus, since if the foundation is faulty, the structure is also compromised. So it's pretty serious. So we get into some of the solutions for how to move forward, obviously, right? So when we say consciousness, we mean more than just what some single word can define. It's a very dynamic thing. When we say consciousness, we're referring to something very dynamic. And so as his studies and his work over the last 50 years have shown and continue to try to present, the components of what consciousness means, or the science of consciousness, is given in a very competent way in this German philosopher named G.W.F. Hegel, especially in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. So Hegel's book was subtitled The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. It describes forms of consciousness such as sense certainty, perception, understanding, self-consciousness, and reason. The general public is more familiar with terms like mind or ego, or false self, intelligence, which make up consciousness, in addition to spirit, which is beyond consciousness. So there's when we get to that conversation about consciousness, there's different organs of the body which each have different functions. There's like kind of organs of consciousness which have different functions. Like when some people, from this Vedic perspective, the word mind is called manas in the Sanskrit language, and manas refers to the functional ability of deciding between this or that, to make a distinction between two things. Obviously, that's something happening in consciousness, but it's that functional ability of discerning between this and that is different from the higher order function of then describing how to utilize this and that. Before you know how to utilize something, you have to distinguish it from other things. So these kind of different functions are like organs of consciousness, and these are some of the words that philosophers have used to describe these different organs of consciousness, so to speak. And then in the Eastern world, the ancient Samkhya philosophy described components of consciousness as subtle matter, where there was a dichotomy between matter of the five senses, which they called gross matter, and this matter of consciousness, which was called subtle matter. And so he mentions this to give a warning, because we don't want to get caught in dualism, because that actually is what happened in the historical development of Western science, which gave us this materialistic view we have today. So they divided consciousness and its content into two opposing antithetical principles. That's what happened with Descartes in the West. He had mind, which was called res cogitans, and matter, which was called res extensa. And he called them as two different substances, and he said, but let's now focus on this one substance of res extensa. And that's what led to this whole materialistic, it's different than the self. We can just focus on extensa means extension. So they, length, width, all these kind of measurements, and that's what they focused on. So he's giving a warning about, let's not fall into the same trap again. So all of this is summarized in one verse in a book called the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 3, text 42. It says, Indriyani paranyohor indriyebhya paramana manashastu parabudhir yobudhe partastusa. We start with the senses, and beyond them is the mind. Then digging deeper is the intelligence, or the discriminating power. Still deeper is reason, and beyond this is the self. So the point of quoting this is to show that the Bhagavad Gita has existed on earth for like 5,000 years. So this knowledge is not cutting edge. This is ancient knowledge. This has been known before. So the spiritual teachers caution us not to make the mistake, not to mistake the true self for the false selves, where the true self is an instrument of the whole, but the false self tries to establish itself as a whole, isolated from all other, from the context of the greater whole. So he gives this little chart in the book, a little picture, where the one on the left has a circle with the dot in the middle, and that's kind of like the false ego. People think they're the center of the world, and that everyone thinks that about themselves. So when they confront each other and egos collide, then there's a confrontation, because one thinks they're the center, the other one thinks they're the center, and when those perspectives clash, then they fight, right? So that's like, okay, why do we have war? Why do we have this? All that kind of thing. Everyone thinks they're the center of their own reality. So rather, he says, okay, let's follow that line into the right circle, where we find ourselves as one circle out of many circles, and that center point is what would be called is God, right? The relationship with God, the whole. This is a perspective of God as is the whole, like the whole organism. And you have the cells, so individual cells are part of the whole organism. We're a part of an organic whole, and we're instruments. Our purpose is to fulfill purposes within that whole. And so how to develop our minds in that way, how to develop our investigations of the reality we live with this in mind. So actually we didn't talk about this point here, but the founders of science were also theists. So I don't know if you remember, we talked about how if the founders of science weren't theists, then science probably couldn't have started, because an assumption that theists make is that nature is intelligible. You can know something about this object, not that. So they were all theists. Newton, physics, Boyle, he was a chemist, one of the main chemists. Even Descartes, he was a theist, and they thought that nature. How did I just explain this? That basically, So relationality means purpose. It means that you have one relata is related to something else, and it's existing for that thing it has a relationship with. It's reciprocal. This desk is existing for me as sitting in it, but also in some way I'm existing to fulfill the purposes of this desk in some way, very superficial. So there's always a purposeful relationship. So the founders of science saw that nature existed as basically the reason they presumed that nature was intelligible, that you could know something about nature, was because so nature was a creation of the purposes, it was fulfilling the purposes of God, that they also had a relationship with God, and that because nature was created from that mind, from the divine mind, then that they could know what the content of that mind was through their investigation of nature. So their whole motivation was to know the mind of God through studying nature, and that made sense as a plausible activity, since God is purposeful, then things which come from that purposeful entity are also filled with purpose, and those purposes can be uncovered. But we find that today, people who are atheists, especially, basically today science is like the reason people go to atheism. Like they think that by becoming more scientifically informed of the reality, then you have less of a reason to believe in God. This is kind of what we see today. But those people don't acknowledge purpose in nature. Like we learned about one guy named Richard Dawkins. He denied that there was any kind of purpose in nature. That he is a biologist himself, he's an evolutionary biologist, but he was an evolutionary biologist who subscribed to molecular reductionism, that everything was matter in motion, that cells weren't cognitive, that they weren't executing purposes with collectives for the purposes of the organism. He denies all of that. So these people with an atheistic disposition, they don't acknowledge or even see perhaps that purpose in nature. So how could they have come to the position of inquiring about nature in a scientific way in the beginning? It doesn't seem they could have. So the whole point of me explaining this is to show how that perspective of consciousness being first, that has a theistic development, leads us to search that relation between us and our environment, and has an assumption that we can know about the environment. And that is what gave birth to the scientific endeavor, which then unfortunately made other assumptions like mind and matter were separate, and the whole philosophical thing that Descartes did and Francis Bacon. So it ended up kind of like getting away from where it started. But nonetheless, the fact that it started there is important to reflect on. I guess that's the takeaway. Anyhow, so I hope I didn't get away from the point too much. The false self conceives itself as independent, and so we went into all that.
Oh, sorry, I have to go.
You have
I
to
have
go?
class.
Yeah, sorry. I know
At
we went over.
3:35.
Oh my God.
I didn't realize
Get out of
this.
here.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. This is interesting. I never thought to think this way.
I'm glad you could come. And,
Thanks, man.
later.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully see you guys around campus. Are you a student or?
Yeah, I graduate this May.
Oh wow, congrats. And then you?
Junior. I'm a junior. You're a junior, yeah?
Credits, I'm a senior, but technically a second year.
Sophomore?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Cool.
but I came in with credits from high school.
Where did you go to high school?
Absegami?
Abstinent.
Yeah.
We'll get to class.
Yeah. I have physics actually, so
Alright.
that's so fun.
Thanks for coming, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Have a good day.
I'll see you.
This is. So what do you think about what we said so far?
It's deep. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
She's awesome.
Yeah.
You're right. she had like some real interest. She's open-minded. That's very nice to see. Anyhow, so this is, you know, what our motivation is for having that talk for next Friday, to see how much of this our panelists are aware of already, how much they're not, how much they would agree on what they're aware of, and how much they're open to hearing some of what's in this book. That's basically, you know, it's like an experiment, a social experiment. Like any discussion, any kind of talk about these kind of topics is always like an experiment, you know? We don't know what people think, but that's why we've asked them to write something before they come. Like Professor Eaton just sent his, it was real nice.
Yeah, he's great. He was just talking to me about it today. How he sent it in. He was like, I don't know how he's gonna think of it, but it's what I want to say. And he was like, I feel like that's the whole point of the event. I was like, absolutely. Like, he's not gonna care what you write. He just wants you to write what you think so that you can bring that to the table. Like, it's gonna be great, whatever it is. I bet. So.
It's like 4 pages.
Really?
Yeah. It was awesome.
He's awesome.
Yeah, he really is.
But yeah, like this, what I'm thinking of this is we've come too far. Like, we need to take a step back, to take a few steps back probably to move forward, because it's not that we've come too far, but at a certain point we took a left instead of making a right, and it might not have been the wrong turn, or maybe we can go down both and then have a view. I don't know if I'm describing it right. I want to backtrack away from that 2 turns, but we've made a decision to go down one path and think that's like the right way, and I don't know that is the way. Like, there's a psychiatrist that I'm connected with, and he practices hypnosis. I've mentioned this to you before probably, but like, that was a practice that was started and invented way long ago, like, and now they're using it to like cure a whole bunch of sets of mental disorders, and it's free, right? It's not putting stuff into your body that's going to change everything. It's changing what's going on in here and slowing it down, and trying to bring back memories and change things naturally, I would maybe want to say, like without putting stuff in your body that's going to chemically change what's going on inside. Instead, it's just changing what's going on in your mind, which is, you can control your mind and get a grip on your mind. Like, that's the best way to do it, right? Because then you don't need all the chemical induced changes that will happen when you start to take these different medications. And I think that's true for a lot of the mental disorders that are out right now, but it's so profitable for corporations to pump these drugs out because they're going to get prescribed. Psychiatrists, a lot of them don't care, right? They just want to make the money. And how are they going to make the money? They're going to tell these kids and tell these people and tell these underserved populations that they need this thing, but they probably don't need this thing. They probably need to, I don't know exactly what all, I can't generalize for everybody, but they might need to like go for a run, eat better food, stop doing this, start doing that. And yes, it's really hard because they're in underserved populations, but I feel like there can be a lot more interventions that aren't taking stuff that will probably help the problems that they're experiencing before then just being like, yeah, have these. So that's what I think.
Yeah. What I got from that was moving away from all these exploitive practices. Like right now, everyone is trying to exploit everybody else, right? But there's these methods like hypnosis, which exist, which are much less exploitive because you're learning, you're empowering someone with a capacity that they naturally have. You're not making them believe the answers to their questions lie outside of themselves, and that they are victims of people who control these substances. It's empowering people that they are enough as they are. Right?
And more in control as well. Like, you can control what's going on. Like, there are like the mental disorders. I'm only talking about mental disorders. Like, I don't know. Well, you could relate it to like cardiac and all sorts of stuff by just changing your habits, right? Like, we know what's healthy, we know what can, obviously genetics plays a role, but that's where like it's the whole picture that you gotta look at to like, try to cease these issues that people face medically and mentally.
But now beyond the scope of being able to heal a disease, whether biological or psychological, what approaches do people have to cope with the simple existence, undeniable existence of mortality in general? Right? We can heal diseases, we can try to prolong life as much as possible, but mortality is something that will happen no matter what. And the implications of that for how we lived our life, for what might come after, haven't been addressed. Right?
I think how we live our life is important to look at in this lens, but what comes after? This is where we're getting into like religion, and I don't really, like, I don't practice much. Like, I believe there's something more, but I don't know what. Like, I don't know what it is. And I don't know.
Like, do you know who, or have you heard the name Alexander the Great?
Yeah.
So when he was dead, when he was dying, he told his, like, a whole team of doctors, he said, put me on the stretcher, put all my gold, all my riches, as much as can fit, on top of my corpse, and walk with my stretcher on your shoulders through the streets of the city and the village and like that, to show that, Alexander the Great was like the craziest conqueror of all time, and he was so rich, and he achieved so much, and how much of that could he take with him when he was dead? None of it. So here, you might as well take it now that you're still here. So he was trying to show, because he was a student of Aristotle.
Wait, they stacked it on him?
On his corpse, after he died. This was his instruction before he died to do this.
So for people to take off of him?
Yeah. And to see that he couldn't take it with him.
Oh.
Both. Because he was trying to demonstrate the philosophical point, because he was a student of Aristotle. Mm-hmm. That I did all this, I got all this money, all these riches that everyone is so desperate for. And now that I'm gone, obviously it's sitting here on top of me because I couldn't take it with me. So, although while we're alive, we try to make that money and live a good lifestyle and enjoy it to the most, how does it make us feel? And maybe some people can't relate to it because it's so abstract, so far away. But the fact that these things that we're working our whole life for, all of our time, all of our energy, and we can't take that with us. It doesn't affect us once we die. I mean, for some people like him, that was very much of a bother. So if we ignore things that both philosophy and religion have said for a very long time, that who we are is not the body, that we are a soul inhabiting this body, and that soul continues to exist after this body stops working, then for people like Alexander the Great, who could feel the gravity of those kind of teachings, especially when he was about to leave the world, then reflections like that on, I did all this to accumulate bodily wealth and pleasure, things that I can't take past this life. So what did I actually do that I can take past this life? Maybe not a lot, maybe something. Those kind of considerations became very relevant, very real. For people who think they have like another 90 years to live, it might not seem that way. Although even that's an illusion, because as we know, crazy stuff happens.
You died.
You could get
in 5 seconds.
5 seconds.
Bomb could drop right now. Yeah.
So what are we doing with our time now that will be of value to us, even past death? And of course, that would mean that we have to have some kind of idea that
there is
we aren't the body. Yeah.
to me, that means you have to believe in the soul thing, that you're going somewhere. Like, whatever's going on in here, I know I'm not going to be in this body, but like, you are going somewhere afterward, which like, I think is deep, and you need to be intellectually sound and advanced to like really grasp that. Like, I feel like that's almost like more than, I guess that is what religion really is getting at, yeah? Like, that there is more and you're gonna go on.
Yeah, but it's not as highly intellectual as you might think. Like, there's one verse in Bhagavad Gita that shows, or tells, that your body right now is changing. Like for me, when I was a baby, I had a birthmark my mom called a strawberry on my arm, right? It's not there now, right? Science tells us every 10 years, on the cellular level, the body completely new. The cells die, the whole metabolic process. So your body, constitutionally, is a new body several times throughout this one lifetime. Yet, you're always creator. You have a unified sense of self. Even though the body it's a different body. Scientifically speaking, it's a different body. But you're still considering yourself the same person. New experiences, you learned a few new things, no problem. But you're still the same person. So what is that consistent thing which is remaining despite the fact that the body is different, your experiences are different, knowledge is different? That's what the soul is, that's what the self is. This unity that is persistent despite all these changing circumstances. So that's what the Bhagavad Gita tells, to show how immediate and how almost self-evident the existence of the soul is. It's you've been thinking of yourself as the same person for as long as you can remember, same as me. Even if someone wanted to really argue and say, actually, I'm not the same person. I have a different name. I changed things about my body. I'm a completely different person. Pardoning some rules of social, of political correctness, you can say, but you have memories of that other person, right? That other you have memories of that other person from a first-person experience. Even though you don't call yourself that person anymore, you're a completely different person. Nonetheless, you still have first-person experiences of that other person. So it's the same thing, right? We are the same entity is existing despite the changing body in this lifetime, despite the changing mind. I mean, we could have a radically different perspective. I mean, we do. Like, the way you think now is probably so different than the way you thought 10 years ago. But you're still the same.
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
But you're still the same person.
Yeah.
So if your mind has changed completely, your body has changed completely, your circumstances have changed completely, but you're still the same person. What is that? Okay. So if that's the case, and we can accept that, I mean, this is like a rational way to think about it, then this idea that we should use that time and energy for things which are not just satisfying bodily demands becomes much more pertinent. Like it did for Alexander the Great. So, there are very sober ways sober reasons to think along these lines, but we're never taught that. Like what I just explained to you, it's too intellectual. Well, I know I never learned that throughout elementary school, high school, here. Like this stuff has been around thousands of years. Like,
well, that goes down to like school in itself. These days, it's like, seriously, like, come on. The whole system is just like, what's like really going on here? Which is why I like when you brought up like, A, like, can't take it with you, and B, like, the portion about, I was about to say, like, I thought you were about to tell me the key to happiness, but you were saying about like, what if you're if you buy into this way of thinking and going about life and turning it in, and you need the A and you need all this and you need the money and you want to have this nice life, like there's gonna come a point, you see those like you see those reels or memes where like the guy that's in the finance and working every day is like, what am I doing? And like wipes all the shit off his desk and he's like, I'm free. Like that's to me that's so real. Like, but some people will never even get there and just like really just buy into this like these normalities, these formalities that like life seems to have come to because of the evolution of humans, and because we're so advanced, more so than all these other things. Like, but I liked when you said you can't bring it with you, and like you really buy into that way of thinking and think that's all there is really, then like you're not gonna be completely happy, or you won't know that there's more. There's definitely more when you let go, I think. I'm getting lost in my senses now, but first I had to go. But yeah.
This is having these kind of discussions, should be a norm in some way, not a one-off kind of thing, like so this is, we gotta keep doing what we're doing.
That was awesome.
So without consciousness, our body of flesh and blood, muscle and bones wouldn't stand, right? This is one point back to. So gravity keeps us, our feet on the ground, right? But what force keeps our body erect?
Consciousness?
Yeah, right? If you're not conscious, you're a lump on the ground, literally. You pass out. you ever see those videos of fainting goats?
No.
No? there's like a species of goat with some kind of neurological disorder where they just will lose consciousness at random points of time. And so they're walking around, whatever, doing their goat thing, and then they just pass out and they're on the ground. Their tongue is out of their mouth. And then they get back up, they start doing their thing. So the point is that without consciousness, the body doesn't stand, right? So this force of consciousness, if you want to call it a force, is so essential that it's not only what keeps the body.
Oh, that would be a good point for Philip, because like forces in physics, like how many newtons is the force of your brain keeping you standing up?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not your feet doing that, it's your mind, right?
Exactly. It's being conscious. Being conscious it permeates the entire body.
But I guess you can then say it's once you fall, it's just displaced over a bigger area. So the force is, your mass force is still going up. It's just
the same forces acting on your body standing up are the same forces acting on it standing down. So the fact that those forces are being resisted when you're standing up means there's something else that's not being accounted for. Gravity is still working the same way.
But when you fall down and pass out, the same forces are acting like you're still pushing, gravity's pushing you up, and you're pushing down with the same amount than if you were when you were standing.
Yeah, the gravity is acting the same. The force is the same. The external force of gravity is the same whether you're standing or on the ground.
Yes.
On the ground. So that means that. So what's the difference, right? If us standing, that example won't work, but it's what's the difference? If you have the equal value of gravity when you're standing up, then when you're passed out on the ground, what's that difference of energy that's allowing you to stand up, which makes functionally everything different? Like you can walk, right? It makes a functional difference. There's a functional difference. It's not. Some people who want to see things from the mechanistic perspective only, they would make an argument that, well, actually, when you think about it, laying down on the ground, being a lump on the ground is the same thing as standing up, because all they see is forces. But obviously, functionally...
I guess, yeah, when you talk about energy, you have potential energy to fall down when you're standing up, and then only kinetic energy when you fall down, because you can't fall anymore. So the consciousness, I guess, keeps you with the potential, like you have... You could argue that you don't have potential energy standing up, but you do, because you can fall down and be laying on the ground, which then means you can't fall you can't have any more kinetic energy than when you are laying. Like,
no. When you're laying down is when you have the least amount of kinetic energy. It's when you have kinetic energy is energy in motion. Potential energy is before the energy is activated. So if I'm sitting here, I have the potential to stand up and scratch my head, but it's not kinetic yet. It's only kinetic when I'm actually standing up and scratching my head. The energy is put into motion. The potential is actualized. So when you're standing up, you have the potential to walk forward, walk backwards. You have more potential.
See,
You have actually, right, a dead.
I don't know that, like, the way that I learned, I might be think maybe it's different for how humans go, but when you're at a height,
Yeah.
you have potential energy. When you're not at a height, you don't have potential energy. Like, if it's on a flat surface, whatever you define the height as 0, that's where you have the most kinetic energy. When you're at the highest point, that's when you have the highest potential energy. But that might just be like, you might be right, but there's different definitions then. Because that's how I just did energy in physics. But that's how I learned it. But I know, like, I remember in high school I took physics as well, and that sounds similar. Like, when you start moving, it's kinetic energy. And when you're at rest, it's all potential energy. But that might be, I don't know, we'll have to ask Philip.
Yeah, and that's all about a body. Like, so if we want to go that definition of potential energy, then it doesn't matter whether the body is dead or alive, right? The body still has the potential to fall down the mountain of whatever that altitude is. So then, for the purposes of this talk, that the potential energy is such that it doesn't make a difference whether something is dead or alive. So looking at just that perspective loses all functional differences between a living and a non-living body. Both have the same amount of potential energy. They can both fall down 10 feet, whatever. So what's the difference? From the perspective of just potential energy, there is no difference between a dead and a living body. From the perspective of any sane person, there is a huge difference between a dead and a living body. So it's the conditioning to try to reduce biology to physics or even to chemistry. But so for this slide, this is where we got there. So if we can admit that consciousness is this force acting on a body to make it stand, then we can acknowledge that, or at least we can consider how the whole movement of a galaxy, right? These planets that are floating in space, what is keeping them there? You know, and it's not just a stationary thing, right? The solar system isn't just fixed. The solar system itself is moving through the universe. So there's so much consistent motion happening because, again, consciousness is there. What's keeping that? That's a whole Newton. That was one of Newton's ideas. I'd like to hear what Philip Eaton has to say about that.
He'll be great. I know. And he told me today, he's like, even if like 4 kids come, like,
he doesn't care.
Yeah, he's like, that's the point is still the point of like having a conversation like this, which I thought was like really cool to hear from him. Yeah, like
exactly the kind of mood we want these people to have. He's a real positive guy. I went to his office to put up a flyer maybe a couple weeks ago. I didn't expect him to be there. I was just going to put it on his door because he gave me permission to do it. He was there. He was like all cheerful, had like all this energy.
He drinks a lot of coffee. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, he was just he was very positive and very polite, and he didn't deal with people in like a superficial way. He was like asking questions and very attentive. And you felt his presence, So I appreciate that. He's paying attention. He's trying to have enlivening conversations. He's trying to learn about other people's perspectives. He's trying to articulate what he knows. And
he's really into education. Like,
oh yeah?
He wants, which is really refreshing because I'm gonna run. I got some homework, but yeah. Are you gonna keep going for the rest of it? Yeah.
I'm not gonna talk about this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna close it down.
But
he's into education.
He's into education, and like he makes it so you can it's really easy to succeed, and when it's really easy to succeed, chances are the kids are going to learn what the topics are being presented. And for a subject like physics that's so like it takes a lot of brain power to really like understand the concepts and like see the connections and connect the dots really of like all these different theorems and formulas and all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm sure you know if you've ever done physics, it's not really the easiest subject, but he makes it like easy for students to succeed, like I said, and I think that like that's what you want. Like you want students to succeed. You shouldn't be like, it shouldn't be how am I gonna get enough C's, it should be like how am I gonna get all these kids to get A's, because like who really cares? What does it really matter, right? Like, I don't know.
Everything we were just saying about the deficiency of education before, this is the right approach to it. You want people to succeed, you want people to actually learn, not just get the grade they need to pass the class and not remember anything.
And like
Good. Sounds like a really good teacher.
when students succeed, they want to learn more, right? Like when you make it so challenging, and like that professor we were talking about in biology, it's like, it's so frustrating. Like seriously, I would love to like ask him to come check it out. You know, he'd probably say no, but I might ask him anyway.